taught since 1973. Dr. Graham's research interest is in the 19th century United States history. He is the author of numerous articles and books related to St. Augustine, including Flagler's St. Augustine Hotels, St. Augustine, the 1867 drawings of Henry J. Morton. And if you've never seen this, I really strongly encourage you to get this particular issue of L. Escribano's 1996. It really gives you a perspective, pictorial perspective, of what St. Augustine was like right after the Civil War, but before Henry Flagler came into town. It's illustrations that really speak about the old St. Augustine. And finally, my Bible, The Awakening of St. Augustine for Understanding the 19th Century. Dr. Graham is past president of the St. Augustine Historical Society. He is a descendant of some of St. Augustine's earliest colonists, tracing his family tree back to the Sanchez and Alvarez families in the early 1600s. Dr. Graham received his PhD in history from the University of Florida in 1973. Please welcome Dr. Thomas Graham.
Thank you, Carl, for that kind introduction. And thank you all for being here this morning. And this has been a great session. I feel very honored to be among such an august assembly of scholars and of folks who are interested in history. Well, has so much of this been a downer? Has Florida always been on the losing side of every war? I mean, you think of the American Revolution, we were on the losing side there. We're invaded by the dadgum Georgians in the 1790s. And then again, the War of 1812, we're invaded and the land is devastated. The Second Seminole War, which we haven't discussed, the big Seminole War of the 1830s and early 40s, that retarded Florida's growth. People didn't want to come down here, for they had the biggest Indian war in American history going on. And then the war between the states. Florida is devastated by that war, even though there was not much fighting here. A state whose growth had already been retarded by conflict was really flattened by that war. After the war, Florida is the most backward state east of the Mississippi, the least populated, the most thinly populated, perhaps the poorest state east of the Mississippi. But things are set for a change, as Professor Taylor set us up. I will argue that this time period, between the Civil War, really between the 1870s and World War I, was perhaps saw the greatest change in Florida ever, maybe even greater changes than we've experienced since World War II, although that might be stretching it a bit because we really have lived through a dramatic era of change. But let me, for example, give you transportation. There was a transportation revolution in Florida during this time period between the Civil War and World War I. The railroad ended in Jacksonville, although you did have the old Yulee Railroad that went down to Cedar Key, but essentially the rails stopped at Jacksonville. Well, by the time of World War I, the railroad went all the way to Key West, a huge distance that I think we now appreciate. And railroads were the big thing, by the way, that this was, in the whole United States, the building of the railroads was absorbing more capital than any other business enterprise. And that certainly is true in the state of Florida. This is the great era of railroad building in Florida. Well, but not just railroads. A good roads movement popped up in the 1890s, even before automobiles were here. Various county governments, local governments, were interested in building good roads that that would complement the railroads. Carl Graham Fisher, who we know from the history of Miami Beach, was also the promoter of the Dixie Highway that connected Chicago with Florida. And it arrives in Florida in 1850, tells you where I live, in 1950. So that by 1915 we had an automobile highway, not just in Florida, but that connected us with Chicago. Early in the 20th century, the best surface for racing automobiles was the Ormond Daytona Beach. And in 1903, a world land speed record of 68 miles per hour was set by an automobile on Ormond Beach. Thomas Edison and Henry Ford both had homes in Florida or in Fort Myers. Thomas Edison thought that electric cars would be the cars of the future, and Henry Ford bet on the internal combustion engine. And we've all thought, well, I guess Ford was right on that. But we'll see. I mean, Edison may have the last laugh with his electric cars. On water, by 1912, the Intracoastal Waterway had been completed so that you could go from the Chesapeake Bay to Miami through the Inland Waterway, which Pedro Menendez would have found very convenient in the fall of 1565 in terms of getting to Fort Caroline. But a mammoth engineering feat, the dredging of that canal along the east coast of Florida. The first scheduled airline in the United States began operation in 1914, flying people between Tampa and St. Petersburg. 1914 is also the year that the U.S. Navy established its aviation school in Pensacola. So we've gone, in a period of about 40 years, we've gone from ox carts to airplanes in Florida. That's a dramatic transformation. 1908, Jacksonville was the wintertime movie studio capital of America. When the winter darkness settled over the north, the movie industry came to Jacksonville and would make movies. St. Augustine was a favorite place for many of these early movies because St. Augustine had so many interesting locales, interesting vistas. So if you could make a swashbuckling movie, at the Castillo or maybe one of Henry Flagler's hotels. To mention population, Florida's population, which had been retarded for so long, doubled during this time period after the Civil War, Reconstruction. So there was a doubling of population, which had been repressed for such a long time. Remarkable to see that happen. Yet Florida's population was tiny. The census of 1880 showed total population in the state of just 270,000 people. I haven't looked at chapter 1, Dr. Gannon, where are you, of the new book, but there may have been fewer people in Florida in 1880 than there were when Juan Ponce de Leon arrived in 1513. Because we had had that precipitous population collapse with the arrival of the Europeans. By 1920, the population had almost quadrupled to just less than 1 million people. So dramatic population increase during this time period, and yet by 1920 we don't even have 1 million people in the state. And now we have more than 18 million. So to put that in a modern perspective. Florida was one of the youngest states in the Union, which is typical of a frontier state, because what you have is young people moving in. And we've kind of changed that these days. Florida is now one of the older states in the Union. We had not quite become the old folks' home for America. Well, how did people make a living in Florida? Well, we have that commonly quoted reference to all sweet taters and sick Yankees in Florida. Leading into the Civil War, Florida was a typical cotton and slave deep South state. It's no wonder that we seceded so rapidly, because we were so much like Georgia and Alabama, and indeed most of our population had just moved over across the border from Georgia and Alabama. Tallahassee was the center of population, the most economically prosperous part of the state. But that's going to change. Cotton is still going to remain a major crop in Florida, but it is losing significance. Florida's economy is going to take off in different directions. One of those is citrus. The early citrus industry has been mentioned a couple of times. We've had waves of success in citrus. The first one ends in 1835 with a big freeze, followed by diseases. But then the oranges make a comeback about the time of the Civil War, so that we have a second big period of citrus prosperity in the 1870s, 80s, down to 1895, when there's another big freeze. That doesn't wipe out the citrus, well, it does wipe out the citrus industry, but it causes the citrus industry to move farther south down the peninsula. But citrus becomes a part of something that differentiates Florida from the rest of the South. And citrus, as Dr. Taylor just pointed out, the rise of the citrus industry goes along with the rise of the railroad industry, because the problem had always been, for example, in the 1830s, how do you get your oranges to market in Philadelphia, New York, and Boston before it spoils? Well, the railroad solved that problem. With the railroads, you could now go from Florida to New York in 32 hours, a time that it's hard to beat today by automobile. You know, I think the people riding the Pullmans back in those days probably enjoyed the trip between Jacksonville and New York more than we do today, fighting the traffic on I-95. Another thing in the area of agriculture that fits right in again also with the railroads is the winter vegetable industry. That places like Sanford in the central part of the state, which advertised itself as the celery capital of the world, but winter vegetables, very profitable. You could make money quickly in winter vegetables. An orange grove took 7 years to mature and become profitable, but you could make money in winter vegetables right away. And again, put your crop on railroad cars, even refrigerated railroad cars, and zip it north of Chicago, northern markets. Northerners are delighted to have Florida lettuce, tomatoes, beans on their tables in January, February, March, when everything's dead and gray up north. We also got this lucky discovery of phosphate, something that was mentioned last evening in our first session. Florida became the world's leading producer of phosphate, which is used in fertilizers and all sorts of other products. Another industry that's an old Florida industry that reached increased volumes at this time was lumbering. That this was the time when, essentially, when we cut off our old growth forests. Those longleaf pines that had been here when the Spanish arrived get cut down and sawed into lumber and shipped all over, not just the United States, but the world to build housing, build buildings, and also to burn up in spectacular fires, like the fire of 1901 in Jacksonville, because that pine lumber is full of rosin that likes to burn. So we had two legs of the economic stool in Florida. Agriculture, extractive industries like lumbering and phosphate. And then we get the third one, the rise of the modern tourist industry. And we usually mention the names Henry Plant and Henry Flagler here, and well, we should. But there had been a long history of Northerners coming to Florida in the wintertime, even back before the Civil War. Many of them, though, were the aforementioned sick Yankees, people who had tuberculosis and who came south just trying to survive with what Floridians called the disinfecting salt air and the sunshine that we had in the wintertime. So Florida had been known as being a healthy place, but only in the wintertime, because in the summertime you got the fevers. And if you were a Northerner, if you were a smart Yankee, you did not want to come to Florida in the summertime, because that was the time when you got malaria or yellow fever and died. And so that was a limitation, that Europeans stayed out of Florida because of the fevers. Well, we have the fortune of Walter Reed's discovery of the cause of yellow fever, or the carrier of yellow fever during the Spanish-American War. A fortuitous sidelight of that war. And once we realized, aha, it's the mosquito that is the vector for yellow fever, we had taken a huge step toward eradicating that disease that had for so long limited population growth. So now Henry Flagler and Henry Plant, the great railroad builders, great hotel builders, could bring not just the winter tourists, but also permanent homesteaders to Florida. Although I should add, it won't be until the 1960s, really, that we get air conditioning. And then you finally get, I guess, the last of the really wimpy Yankees who moved to Florida and now can live in an air-conditioned environment year-round. Henry Flagler built the first bridge across the St. Johns River. It was a railroad bridge. One thing that I find interesting is that every town had its own time. For a long time here in St. Augustine, the Catholic Cathedral decided what time it was. And with Henry Flagler's railroad, he brought in railroad time, because the railroads needed to have a standard time for operating their railroads, so the trains could make connections. So railroad time came in with Henry Flagler. The United States adopted standard time in 1918 during the First World War. Well, let's see. Other things we get, we can take St. Augustine as an example. Carl, thank you for mentioning asphalt streets. Henry Flagler was a pioneer in asphalt streets. Water systems, electric systems, sewer systems, the kind of things that we associate with modern life come in during this time period. really, if you're going to have a large population, you can't get by with coquina wells in the backyard anymore. You've got to have a large public water system, and then a gas system, and then an electric system. By this time, the modern configuration of Florida's population was beginning to show up. Florida's population had clustered along the Georgia-Alabama border, but now the population is growing south down the peninsula. The old cotton era is over. Modern Florida has arrived. These trends are going to accentuate in the 1920s. All right, Carl, do I have a couple more minutes here? 5 minutes. Politics, all right, we've saved the worst for last. This is the era of the Bourbon Democrats, the conservative Democrats, who had a program that actually you can say is a progressive program in the sense that they wanted to attract population, they wanted to attract capital, and they wanted to, well, I guess the other thing, keep down taxes and spending by the government. And I should also add they wanted to make sure that Florida was and remained a white man's country. Elections. You remember the 2000 election when Florida decided who was going to be president? Well, we had one of those in 1876, the Hayes-Tilden election, in which Florida ultimately decided that Rutherford B. Hayes was going to be president of the United States, and not Samuel Tilden. An election that was full of, well, honest-to-goodness dishonesty that time. Not just butterfly ballots, but intimidation of black voters and miscounting of ballots and that sort of thing. But the Democrats were in, the Reconstruction Republicans were out. And pretty much the Bourbon Democrats mostly had their way, and yet we did have progressives. We did have those people who said that they stood up for the common man and stood up against the interests, and by the interests they meant the railroads, but also big corporations. And also this idea of, well, it's wealthy northern capitalists who are taking over the state. This is the time when black citizens were virtually eliminated from the political system. The new Constitution of 1885 instituted a poll tax. You had to pay your tax in order to register to vote. And this combined with various other legal subterfuges and frankly just physical intimidation minimized black voting. St. Augustine had its last black city commissioner, I think, in 1903, and that's pretty typical of the rest of the state. Last thing here, leaving out most of the politics. The environment, not much concern with the environment. William D. Bloxham, the hero of the Bourbon Democrats, had this proposal to drain the swamps. And he made a deal with Hamilton Diston of Philadelphia to begin that process of draining the swamps and also giving away thousands of acres of land to Diston in exchange for that. So Bloxham was the conservative who was draining the swamps. And then you had Napoleon Bonaparte Broward, later governor from 1905, who is our progressive governor, and his program is also draining the swamps. So whether you were a progressive or a conservative, you agreed that draining the swamps was a good idea. There was very little concept of our modern ecological environmental sensitivity. With Broward, it was the idea that, well, we'll drain the Everglades and then we'll divide it up into homesteads and small farmers can go down there. Well, it didn't work out that way. Big Sugar came in instead of pioneer farmers. But we did get to end up a little bit on the good side here. We did get the environmentalists who were concerned about saving the Florida plume birds. Women wore feathers in their hats in those days. So we got people like Mayman Jennings and the origins of the National Audubon Society. Their first big crusade was to save the plume birds. And this was a rough start. Some of the first game wardens were assassinated by the plume hunters. We did get the beginning of some parks. Teddy Roosevelt, we'll tip our hats to him. He created Pelican Island as the first national wildlife refuge in 1903, Pelican Island down intercoastal on the East Coast. The Ocala National Forest was created in 1905, the first national forest east of the Mississippi. So we did, towards the end, we did get some concern with the environment, partly because people could look around. They could see that the forests had all been chopped down. And they said, you know, we can't keep doing this. And so we did get some concern about at least scientific management of the forest. And so here we are in 2013, a century after this time period, and some of the political problems, some of the environmental problems are starting to sound kind of familiar. And I will leave it at that. Thank you very much.
I'm going to open the floor for questions so that we all can eat. So anyone interested in bringing up some of the points that authors raised so wonderfully, please go to the microphone.
Oh, did I take the mic? All right. Mine's for Dr. Graham. Dr. Graham is so eloquently called the administration or the Democrat Party the Bourbon Democrats. Now, I know there has to be a reason for that, so I'd like you to explain it.
Yeah, it's really Bourbon, from the French ruling family that never learned anything and never forgot anything. The idea was these are the old timers. But in fact, they really weren't old timers. In some ways they were, but they were looking forward to a new Florida, a Florida that would have railroads and thriving businesses and a growing population.
The only old-time thing they wanted was to keep the old-time race relations the way they were, African Americans in their place, and in spite of the fact they were interested in, as Professor Graham said, new economic opportunities, but old race relations.
Group to tell this to. I've been in politics and not helped and not hurt by what I do. But I go through a little town as I go to Sanibel Island and Captiva. I go to a little town called Nocatee. It's just south of Arcadia. And the Baileys have always been in the citrus business and always were buying their packing crates. And Dr. Graham, that's one of the things the lumber was used for, was packing crates for all the citrus that went north to New York, so that you can get there in a day's time. Well, I knocked on doors down there, found some history of Nocatee. The name came about, it looks like it's in Arcadia the way you just drive through. The name came about because the Indians were not aware of this big machine, the railroad, coming into town. And so when it did get there, they had the dedication of the railroad, the Indians were all there asking, what Nocatee? Nocatee means, what is it? Get it? What is it? And that is the reason the expression came about. And so we ended up here with developers, as you mentioned, coming in, and they're still coming in. But I think that's an interesting story because what came out from those builders was that it meant something about beautiful land. And I can tell you after traveling over Florida on horseback that that is one of the things about this area. It is the beautiful land. Thank you.
I think that's a great way to end this session, talking about old Florida, meeting new Florida. Some things change, some things don't, but it's still Florida, whatever that is. Thanks, we'll see you after lunch.